Hello, everybody. My name is Dylan Stiles, and I'm your host for Queer in the Air, a queer political podcast to bring the intersection of queerness and politics into one handy little spot. Today, I am welcomed by Hannah. Hannah is the Victorian chairperson of the Animal Justice Party Youth Group, and we will definitely hear more from Hannah later on. But firstly, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong country of this recording. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hannah, welcome to the podcast and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll just add a little small thing there. I was the chairperson. I started the Young Age AP, but I've recently stepped down to an events coordinator role to try and balance my studies a bit better with it. So we've got 2 new chair people now, but I'm still very involved.
Fabulous. We do love a dedicated person to their studies. So well done. And Hannah, you are a lovely, proud queer woman. Is this correct?
This is very correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous. So, Hannah, I'm going to kick straight into the questions because that's what people want to hear. So the first question, Hannah, is to introduce yourself, a little bit about your story and your journey to being the proud queer person in politics you are today.
Well, I first came out properly, I would say, when I was 14. I feel like coming out's always, a journey and an adventure, as people who have come out know. I think I came out for the first time to someone when I was 13, but I became fully out when I was 14. Always that interesting moment when you're angsty and you're a teenager in your head and you go, I'm never going to come out, and then you come out like 2 weeks later. So that was sort of my experience. I thought I was bi when I was 13, and I told like one or 2 close friends. But then when I was 14, I had that moment, I have to break up with my boyfriend and let everybody know. So I've been out for quite a long time now. It feels like, even though I'm only 21, it feels like I've, been in the trenches for ages. It's probably been, 6 years? I never said I was good at math. I think it's 6 years. And it's a pretty stock standard, boring thing. It involves introspection, realizing that, I'm not only that I'm not attracted to men and that I am attracted to people who aren't men, but also that I've connected a lot more with queer culture and queer groups, and that I identified a lot more with I got into drag culture and got in those. I just felt like at home with those groups of people. So that was my journey. It was a very sort of alone in my bedroom process of watching clips and like blocking everyone else out and being in my own head. That was my coming out journey, and I've been openly gay to anyone who would listen to me since I was 14. So and then in politics, because I got involved in politics a lot later, I've always been a queer person in politics. I've never been anything else. So
100%. And how was that kind of journey being a queer person in politics? Has that kind of been an interesting journey, or has it been really affirming? How's that, I guess, as an Animal Justice Party member as well?
Yeah, well, Animal Justice Party, I think, is probably one of the easier parties in the world to be queer in, a very progressive party. Our elected state MP, Andy Medic, has 2 openly queer kids, and, he wears his rainbow lanyard thing in solidarity, against his black suit every day in Parliament, has supported legislation on things like, and feels like they'll allow trans people to change their names on their licenses and things without having the surgeries that were once necessary in order for that to happen. I think being in it's a lot easier to be gay, at least from what I can tell, because I've never been a conservative person, but I think it's a lot easier to be queer in progressive spaces than in conservative spaces, which has been incredible. I think the only thing which I think probably it applies to most political parties is, and this is nothing to do with discrimination or barriers really, but I think most political parties' volunteer bases are, they tend to be older people, that do the volunteering, and therefore there's some education that is sometimes required, keeping people up to date with the correct terminology and what things are. And so there just needs, I think the only thing would be just making sure everybody is on the same page about, just a little bit of education here and there. But I've only ever been accepted with open arms in my experience in the Animal Justice Party. The only barriers that I see in politics are in more conservative spaces, which we can get more into.
100%. And I guess what took you towards Animal Justice Party as the party of choice for you?
For me, first and foremost, I've been vegan. I've been vegan also since I was 14. I have my gay and queer and vegan awakening all at the same time. 14 was a very big year for me. And I've been vegetarian my whole life. I was raised with those values. So fundamentally, I was raised with both values of acceptance and openness, and also valuing the rights of animals as well. So I think the Animal Justice Party was a very natural choice for me. I don't think there would have been any other party that I would have gone to, because all of my passions, are shared with with members of the Animal Justice Party.
Awesome. And I think you do have a fabulous MP in Andy Medic. Their contributions, specifically during the birth certificate reform, got me pretty much in the feels. Really incredible contribution by Andy. So the next question, is there someone who you look up to as a role model or mentor and has helped you, I guess, on this journey to politics and on this journey as a queer person and that intersection?
The first person that comes to mind isn't a politician at all, but the person who I looked up to as a role model when I was discovering my sexuality and coming out was my favorite singer, was always Madonna. And although she's not a politician, she's always been very political in her work, I think, and very open in talking about queer politics in a time where the religious right ruled America and the AIDS epidemic was ripping through the queer community. And I remember sort of studying that time in American history, or even in just queer history across the globe, and being very touched by not just her response, being one of the people who was being one of the only celebrities who wouldn't just shy away from the gay community, but actually embrace the gay community during a time where they were, people did distance themselves. It's very popular to be pro-gay now as a celebrity. It wasn't at the time. But someone who, just like how the community sort of rallied together at the time when the Paris is Burning documentary came out and stuff as well. So I remember the politics of that time is very inspiring to me as a queer person. It made me think about how grateful I am for the society I live in now. Of course, we've got ways to go, but compared to how it was back then, and the grassroots political movements that got us to where we are now, and the movers and shakers that help sway public opinion in the to be more accepting towards queer people. So that's someone who inspired me, who isn't a politician. With regards to politicians, honestly, I find people like Andy Medic, honestly, and obviously rather, and Emma Hurst, our elected MPs, extremely inspiring in that they're people who, it's not a popular opinion to be pro-animal rights and to be vegan. It's actually one of the most, I think, because I think people think that if you have a progressive political stance, it's like you're never going to get cancelled, you're basically safe, it's like you're shying away from controversy. But I think standing up for animals is one of the most controversial political sort of opinions you can have, and they have it unabashedly. And I think that they represent their values staunchly, and they're uncompromising. And I think that's one of the most inspiring things in politics, because I think we look at political parties, like some of the more mainstream political parties like Liberal and Labour, and you see people having to constantly compromise probably what policy positions they want to push for the sake of optics. Like, if you look at, Anthony Albanese not too long ago in an interview, publicly distanced himself from the concept of being woke, which, I can see why he might have done that. At the same time, some of the questions were completely untactfully answered. And it's just, I don't like, whereas the politicians, I think, in the Animal Justice Party will just stand up for what they believe in. They won't, they don't care as much about just having to look good or, having to compromise their fundamental beliefs in order to appease certain voters. And that's something that's inspiring to me and refreshing in politics.
They are undeniably themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it's great to hear perspectives of that. It's not just the political people who are your mentors and people you look up to and inspired by, but it can be figures in the community. It can be, your next door neighbor potentially. My next one, I think, is a hot topic, and I think is one of the reasons to why I started this podcast, which is around what barriers do you see for the participation of queer people involved in politics, and how do you think we can best overcome these to increase queer representation at all levels of government? And then I guess the little follow-up on that is, what is the Animal Justice Party doing?
So I think when I think of barriers, because I had a little think about this question, what barriers are put up for queer people in politics? Obviously, like I said before, I haven't yet in my political career come up against a heap of barriers, considering I am in one of the most progressive political parties in Australia. However, as someone who's actively involved in a big consumer of politics and political thought, I do somewhat feel for my queer conservative siblings, because I think about how hard it must be to be a queer conservative at some points, because although I'm very much not a conservative, I think that there are always going to be conservatives and there should be conservatives, and that it's a necessary part of the political system. And I look at conservative thought leaders in Australian politics and outside of Australian politics, and whether it's a figure like Ben Shapiro or Pauline Hanson, people on the right are openly anti-queer. And I think if you are someone who identifies as a conservative person and you are openly queer and you're also an advocate for queer people, you're potentially alienating like a large percent of your voting base, which is problematic as a conservative. So I think that's a big barrier. I think it probably is difficult to be a queer conservative person. And that's not to say, because there clearly are, queer conservative people, but they also tend to be white gay men. I think the more intersections that play into that, the harder it is the more of your own voting base you alienate, especially if you're someone who may be a conservative, but also do believe that, that does want to advocate for queer people and does want to be, maybe progressive in that regard, although you may support, a certain tax reform, or you may support, certain economic policy or whatever, or you may be against certain economic policy, and you may be conservative in that way. I think some of the identity politics is insane on the right when it comes to being anti-trans, especially. I think I would be amazed and pleasantly surprised if I ever saw someone, on the right be elected as a trans person. So I think there's quite a barrier there. Something I was thinking about Pauline Hanson and one of her speeches, or just one of her, in Parliament, talking about puberty blockers, I believe, and how if that parents who believe that that their child should have counselling on the topic of their gender identity, they should have their children taken away from them, and that shouldn't be allowed under the age of 18. And this has nothing to do with like even electing, even going on any hormones or anything. Just having counselling about it shouldn't be allowed before 18. I think it's so out of touch with everything that a trans youth goes through. And I think that there is a place in conservative politics for actually listening to trans people's stories and still having that conservative perspective. Maybe you have a different position than me on puberty blockers, where you think that we should be more cautious about the potential negative health effects, but you don't need to have this rhetoric that is coming out of the right. So I think a way to overcome like this a division, I mean, I don't know, this relationship between the right and queer politics, is I think there needs to be a movement among conservative queer people where it's not just, you know, fighting for the rights of maybe like white gay men in conservative politics, but just a paradigm shift in you can bring a conservative perspective to queer issues without, you know, alienating or just like treating queer people as if they're boogeymen. So I think that needs to be driven by queer conservatives. But I understand it is hard probably for, you know, a queer conservative person to be listening to their, you know, favorite politicians talk on the internet and hear them say things like it's immoral to be gay or you go to hell for this and blah, blah, blah. So I think I can imagine it'd be very hard to be conservative and queer, which would, you know, with your internal demons would make it even harder to bring, you know, to be open and proud in the political sphere. So I feel for my queer conservatives but I think the change does need to be driven by them. And I think that, you know, queer lefties also need to support them as queer people, even if there are political differences there, because otherwise there won't be a healthy political sphere or arena for queer people in general. And that's for what the Animal Justice Party is doing. I think, well, it's a good start that we're already very open and inclusive and pro-queer, that I think on any kind of legislation that comes into the parliament, we're going to be supporting, you know, queer people. It has been the case historically, even though our main policy is surrounds animals and animal rights. We aren't a one policy party, and we do have stances on everything you can think of. And so I would encourage anyone to check out our website and check out our policies around queer stuff. And, you know, I have mentioned Andy has 2 trans children, and there are gay people within the party driving that movement. But I think something else that we do is, although we disagree obviously strongly with a lot of, with, you know, most conservative positions probably, I think we are also not willing to talk to people and collaborate with people on things that we agree with and build bridges, which I think is important, and I think is the way to move forward in making the political sphere and conversation more healthy and less partisan.
100%. Thank you so much. And I completely agree with kind of your insights. I think it would be a real struggle from that conservative side of politics and being a queer person. I know we've got Liberal Pride. They're going to be partaking in the podcast further down the track. And I'm really intrigued about their insights around being, I guess, a queer person in the right of the political spectrum. So it'll be really interesting. And I can completely concur on the Animal Justice Party. I don't think any medic has not spoken on any queer policy which has gone through the upper house. I think he's made sure that he's made an active contribution. And I think that is commendable. So thank you so much. And yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head on some of the barriers. And yeah, we definitely all, and hopefully this podcast will open that conversation around how we as queer people in politics supporting each other, and then how is this conversation, this dialogue potentially going to change the tune of those conservative groups who are potentially going to look at one day pre-selecting queer people, trans people. You know, I would love to see a trans person run in the Liberal Party, but it would be really, I would be really open to it. So hopefully we can start that dialogue and we'll see it in the future. My next question for you, and it's the final political question around what advice would you give to a queer person who is looking at entering into politics?
I think My advice again would differ depending on where you're entering politics, what party you're going into, if you're out as well, because that makes a big difference. If you're someone, because I mean, I've had a very privileged experience coming out. I had an accepting family, and I came out into a party that entered politics into a party that wholeheartedly accepts me. So I've been very lucky in that case. I'm going to operate under the assumption that you're already out, because that's a whole other conversation if you're not. I guess my advice would be, again, I mentioned before, be aware that a lot of volunteers who volunteer in political parties are older. That tends to be the demographic, I think, in all political parties, and they are trying their best, but a lot of them are a little bit behind. So I know a lot of people take the attitude that, it's tiring to educate people all the time on queer issues as a queer person. But if you're going into politics and you're trying to advocate for queer people, and you're trying to help queer people, I think you need to take that extra time to, if you see something that's not quite right in the party, some language that's not accurate, just speak up, just send an email, just say something to a person who's a bit higher up than you know, and I'm sure your party would be thankful that you've corrected them on this thing. And for everything you do to try and improve the way that queerness is spoken about, within parties, the easier it is for the next person who's queer to come in. There are things that are as easy as if you're looking at bylaws or the little nitty gritty things that come up when you're reading stuff in parties. If there might be things like, I don't know, good spirited things, like things with the best of intentions, but referring to, gender identities as like sexual orientations, or things that are just, you're like, oh, that's not correct, just correcting things like that. And I guess advice I would give from like my perspective is try and bring your party into the future with you, and try and be a leader in that way. I wish I had, because obviously I think it's harder for conservative queer people, and obviously I have no experience being a conservative queer person in politics, but I think the best, if I were trying to approach that, I think I would try and find people like me, find like-minded people. I think you mentioned that there was a queer liberal queer group that you were having on the podcast. I think that's incredible. I think join that. Find like-minded people and drive the change together, and you'll feel a little bit less alone.
I love it. I definitely think, drive it together. And I really enjoyed your remark around, move your party with the times. And that, as a queer person, you do have that power in a party to do that. And maybe you have to bring some people along with you, but it can definitely happen. Hannah, that was the final political question. Now I have the fun question. It's just the way to break it up, get us to know a little bit more about you. And I'm a little bit of a, I guess, geek when it comes to this kind of stuff. So who is your favorite queer character in a TV show or a movie, and why?
The funny thing is I'm a massive geek on this as well. I feel like I've seen all of the queer stuff. And so that's like a question like this is sort of daunting, because you're like, oh, you've all of the characters in front of you, and you're like, how can you possibly pick one? And especially like, I think if you're a geek, you'll relate. If you look at a lot of the older queer, TV shows, like I grew up watching The L Word, you think about those characters, including the ones you had a crush on and all that, and you're like, oh, a lot of these characters are actually horrible people as well. So I don't know if I can say that like Bette Porter is my favorite queer character, because she also was like a quite a terrible person. But I have a question. Does reality TV count, characters from reality TV?
I'm going to say it's a TV show. So yeah, I'll take it.
All right. I'm going to say then recently, I think Bimini Bon Boulash has to maybe take the cake. Are you familiar from RuPaul's Drag Race UK season 2? Bimini Bon Boulash is a drag queen, and they are non-binary and vegan. And I think as far as like, I think they're the best, most fitting choice, being vegan, being the Animal Justice Party representative. I think just a great role model. I would even go as far as to say role model for gender non-conforming people, and just an amazing drag queen. I guess Bimini Bon Boulash is a character because that's not their birth name. So I mean, I guess you could. I think that counts. I'm going to go with Bimini. Anyone who doesn't know Bimini, go look them up.
I love it. I love it. And we do love our queens. So fantastic. And maybe one day we could see a queen run for office. That would be great. They did that, I believe, in America. There was a queer drag queen who ran as their drag queen.
Really?
Yeah, and I just thought it was absolutely fabulous. So, you know, we're hopefully going to see, you know, that discussion of gender identity in particular. I think queens do it well. Talk about gender identity, and then hopefully, you know, with that being, I guess, a normalized way of people engaging. And I think RuPaul's Drag Race really opens that conversation. Hopefully it will continue on into our political sphere.
Yeah, there are some drag queens I'm surprised haven't run for politics. I think RuPaul has the ego to do it. And Lady Bunny. I think there are a few people who I'm like, I'm surprised there aren't any more drag queen senators with how opinionated and out there they are.
Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great? Well, Hannah, I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been really insightful to hear a little bit more about yourself, a little bit more about the Animal Justice Party and what inspires you as a queer person in politics. Is there any final thing you'd like to say? And then I will sign us off.
Oh, any final thing I'd like to say? I suppose I'd say keep the elections coming up soon. They've got to call it. You know, by the time this is out, hopefully the election's being called. Just when you're voting, make sure you're looking at their voting record and not just their rhetoric. And you know, keep in mind that this is a very important election. See where everyone is, not only on queer issues, but every issue, and vote wisely. That's what I have to say.
Love it. Vote and vote wisely. And yes, I am also hoping that this podcast will be released after the federal election gets called. And we will then be able to start considering where that vote is going. So thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for listening to episode 4 of the Queer in the Air podcast. You can find us on all of your favorite podcast channels. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Insta, and TikTok. And we look forward to hearing from you all next week at our next podcast with The Reason Party. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.